the submarine captain who saved the world, and was immediately fired. Cold open at depth, the order to fire, one dissenting voice. The hull hammered like a drum, lights dimmed then steadied. Depth charges thumped closer practice, the Americans said, but down here it felt lethal. In the control room of B-59, sweat ran like rain. Authorized the special weapon, the captain snapped. One key turned, a second followed. Hands moved toward the final consent, then a voice cut through the heat. No. Silence held as another blast rolled the deck. Three men stared at each other and the world waited. The man who said no would be punished for saving millions, and he knew it. To understand how they got trapped here, we need to go back. How a diesel boat sailed into Armageddon. October 1962. Washington called it a quarantine. Moscow called it a provocation. Between their words sailed 4 diesel-electric submarines, Project 641s, the Foxtrot class, quiet at low speed, stubborn, and built for endurance. One of them, B-59, took aboard a sealed crate labeled simply special. The euphemism was policy. Inside the euphemism was a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. The plan looked straightforward on a wall map. Get to Cuba, slip into Mariel, and establish a forward base. But the sea doesn't respect plans. The Foxtrots had to snorkel to breathe and to feed their batteries. Near Cuba, aircraft hunted anything that stuck a mast above the chop. So each choice carried a penalty: hide and suffocate, or rise and be seen. On B-59, the chain of command had a twist. Captain Valentin Savitsky ran the boat. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov represented the party and guarded the weapon's political seal. And a third presence crowded the steel: Vasili Arkhipov, chief of staff of the submarine brigade, equal in rank to the captain, aboard as the flotilla's senior officer. They shared authority in a system designed to prevent mistakes, and in crisis, that design guaranteed argument. Meanwhile, the Americans built a hunter's net, destroyers in patterns, sonobuoys dropped along invisible fences, helicopters dipping sonar. They wrote manuals calling small charges signaling, a way to say, surface and identify yourself. But nobody had sent those manuals to the Foxdales slipping through warm, oxygen-thin water where the only language was concussion and metal. The boat's own language turned harsh. Saltwater found places it shouldn't be. Gauges fogged, circuits complained, and every repair meant more sweat and less air. Radio contact with Moscow went to static. Messages didn't get through or arrived hours late. News was rumor: an American U-2 shot down, a pilot dead, generals angry. On a diesel boat cut off from the world, uncertainty filled every corner. Did a war start while they were blind? Were the splashes above them a warning or the first blows? Soviet doctrine tried to thread that needle by making rules that bent under strain. There were instructions for the special weapon, guidance about conditions when it could be used if attacked. But those rules met reality in a shaking hull where every blast sounded like an answer demanding a reply. The protocol required senior concurrence. On B-59, uniquely, it required 3. Get this, many of the crew didn't even know the torpedo's true nature. They knew there was a sealed thing. They knew it mattered. The knowledge was compartmented to keep secrets safe, and that compartmenting added psychic weight to the few who understood what a launch would mean. While that was happening in Washington, debates raged over how far to push Soviet subs to the surface. The White House wanted control and time. The admirals wanted compliance fast. A memo told destroyer captains to use small charges as signals. In the noise of an ocean, small is relative. B-59 was assigned a lane toward Cuba. By late October, the lane shrank to a choke point. Snorkeling drew in diesel fumes and hot air. Submerged running drained batteries the crew couldn't fully recharge. Each hour at depth narrowed options. What nobody knew at the time was how close those narrowing choices would come to a decision no one could reel back in. Inside B-59's control room, the captain felt responsible for his men under pressure he could touch. The political officer heard the party's expectation. Arkhipov carried something else, a memory of a reactor that almost melted down, and the price of panic. The secret cargo made every move lethal. The Americans didn't know it was on board. The Soviets couldn't admit it. That set the stage for the moment when signaling and survival would be confused for attack, and three signatures would stand between the blast and the surface. The special weapon, the nuclear torpedo nobody expected. They called it the Special to keep it small enough to fit in a sentence. In reality, it was a T-5 nuclear torpedo, Type 5358, 10 kilotons in its nose, a compact sun strapped inside steel. Soviet planners wanted a card the Americans didn't know was in the deck. The torpedo turned a hunted diesel sub into a potential fleet killer. One shot could erase a destroyer group or cripple a carrier, not by a clean hole in a hull, but by a boiling column of ocean and a shockwave that broke bones and ship keels together. On paper, the rules for using it were precise. In practice, they were written in pencil. Captains received oral instructions. If attacked with depth charges or forced to the surface under threat, they could consider the special weapon. Formal doctrine stacked conditions, enemy action, loss of contact, imminent danger, but the sea isn't formal. B-59's safe was sealed with party locks and procedures. Two officers on most boats had to agree, the captain and the political officer. On this boat, there was a third lock, Archipov's ascent as flotilla chief. It was meant to reduce risk. In the heat, it concentrated it. Training couldn't simulate this. There were no exercises where you tried to think about graduated response, while the hull rang with distant explosions. Men drilled on loading routines and safety checks. They practiced the dance of keys, the mechanical ballet that would arm a warhead without detonating it. But no one can rehearse what happens when procedure collides with fear. Many sailors didn't know the details. Compartmentation kept the circle tight. The torpedoman assigned to the special tube knew. The captain and political officer knew. Arkhipov knew. Others guessed. A sealed crate. Extra guards. A tone of voice that changed when it was mentioned. Rumor ran through the mess like steam. Hiroshima in a tube, the kind of weapon the Americans would never expect from a diesel. The uncertainty worked both ways. It deterred by making the unknown dangerous, and it burdened the few who carried the secret. Moscow's logic was straightforward and cold. The submarines were outmatched, diesels against a navy that owned the sky and the soundscape. Give each boat a nuclear sting, and the calculus changes. Even if American admirals never knew the sting was there, Soviet leaders believed the option might alter behavior at the edge. Meanwhile, American commanders wrote signaling depth charges into their playbook, assuming the other side could distinguish a warning from an attack amid noise and fear. Both strategies trusted clarity that didn't exist underwater. Now put that weapon into B-59's day. Battery low, cooling gone. Thoughts come in fragments, water intake, battery acid, breathe slower. The political officer watches discipline fray and reaches for the thing that reasserts control, procedure. Procedure said the special weapon existed for a situation just like this, cornered, blind, possibly under attack. The captain's duty was survival of the boat and the mission. The political officer's duty was the state's intent. The intent wasn't to surrender. There was also the practical knot. Launch protocols designed for a calm pier had to work in a storm. To arm the torpedo, men had to move through narrow compartments slick with sweat, lift a warhead that groaned metal against metal, align contacts, check seals. One wrong step could wreck more than a plan. The keys mattered, but so did hands steady enough to turn them. Everyone felt the timeline compress. Every minute submerged burned ere the boat didn't have. Surfacing risked humiliation and capture. Firing promised something final. And then there was Archipov's read. The Americans weren't trying to kill them. They were trying to force a surface. He had seen worse decisions made faster on K-19 when improvisation saved a reactor and killed men slowly after. He'd learned that bad information plus urgency is a straight line to disaster. Here, the special weapon didn't solve a problem. It made a gamble that nobody could call back. If they launched and killed an American ship, who in Washington would know it was a cornered submarine making a last choice? What admiral, seeing a mushrooming column of water and a vanished destroyer, would argue for restraint? Special weapon turned those questions into seconds. It had been designed to deter by its very existence, yet its existence had been hidden. It was supposed to keep enemies cautious, yet the enemy had no idea it was there. Inside B-59, that paradox came to a point. The crew's world shrank to a tube, a set of keys, and a vote. Outside, ships traced patient circles, dropping small explosions into a language that didn't translate. The special weapon waited for 3 signatures. 2 were ready, 1 wasn't. The men, Captain Savitsky, Political Officer Maslenikov, and Vasili Arkhipov. Start with the man in the captain's chair. Valentin Savitsky wasn't reckless, he was responsible. Years in submarines had taught him the math of risk, how long a battery really lasts, how fast panic spreads through a steel tube, how a commander carries every life aboard like a weight in his chest. He knew his crew by scent and sound, the coughs that meant Co-2 was winning, the shuffle of a sailor trying not to faint. In that heat, duty became physical. Keep the boat alive. Keep the mission intact. If the Americans wanted to humiliate his command, force them to the surface under explosions, he felt that as an attack on his men and on the uniform he wore. Savitsky's strength was decisiveness. He made choices in seconds because seconds were all a captain got underwater. But decisiveness has a shadow when information goes bad. Cut off, battered, and exhausted, he reached for a tool that restored agency, the special weapon. It wasn't glory, it was control in a moment that felt like collapse. He had to think 2 steps ahead, surface and risk boarding, or fire and open space around the boat. He wasn't gambling with abstract strategy. He was trying to stop the deck from rolling under the feet of men he'd sworn to bring home. Across from him stood Ivan Maslenikov, the political officer. His job wasn't to fight the boat, it was to align it. He carried the party's presence into every compartment, the doctrine, the moral certainty that the mission served a state under siege. On paper, he shared the captain's burden. In practice, he guarded the locks, literal keys, and the ideological line. Under pressure, Maslenikov read danger differently. Forced surfacing looked like weakness that could invite exploitation. If depth charges were signals, they sounded like domination. He'd been trained to resist that, to meet pressure with firmness. Agreeing to arm the special weapon wasn't zeal, it was coherence with orders that told him, do not yield initiative to the enemy. Maslenikov knew the maintenance of discipline wasn't just shouting and citations. It was giving men a story that made sense, why they were sweating through their uniforms, why they couldn't breathe right, why their heads pounded. The party gave that story shape. The Americans were aggressive. The Soviet sailors were steady. If provoked, they would answer. In that frame, his consent made the room feel less chaotic. Procedure was clarity. The 2 keys together were proof that the state still had control inside a hulking tube that felt like it was coming apart. Then there was Vasili Arkhipov, equal in rank to Savitsky, but carrying a different kind of authority, the memory of K-19. He'd watched a crew stare down an invisible catastrophe, improvise, and pay for it with their bodies. D felt the nausea of radiation exposure and the confusion that follows when official words lag reality. K-19 had taught him how systems bend under stress, how rumors fill vacuum, how the urge to act fast can be the most dangerous thing in the room. On B-59, he wasn't just another vote. He was the flotilla's chief of staff, the senior present voice for a larger doctrine that said, survive today to fight tomorrow. Arkhipov didn't see restraint as weakness, he saw it as seamanship. In a control room baked to the edge of thought, he tried to slow time. We surface, we signal, we think, wasn't cowardice to him. It was a way to keep choices open. He read the explosions above as a language, clumsy, infuriating, but not lethal intent. He asked a question that cut through heat and pride. If we launch and kill a ship, what happens next? Not on this deck, but out there, in Washington, in Moscow, in silos, and on bombers already spinning up. He knew the answer wouldn't come from anyone in that room. It would be decided by people who weren't sweating and couldn't hear the hull. This was the triangle. Savitsky's duty to his crew and command, Maslenikov's duty to the state's will and narrative, Archipov's duty to a broader horizon where the boat wasn't the center of the map. All 3 men were patriots. All 3 wanted to live. None of them had clean information. The rules said unanimity, and unanimity now demanded a shared picture of the world outside steel. They didn't have one. The argument wasn't theatrical. It was short, tight, edged by fatigue. Savitsky pressed the logic of survival under fire. Maslenikov pressed the logic of resolve under provocation. Arkhipov pressed the logic of escalation under uncertainty. Each logic carried real stakes. If they surfaced and the Americans used live depth charges, men could die quickly. If they fired, millions could die later. If they hesitated and stayed down, the batteries might fail, and men could die quietly in the dark. Get this, every sailor in earshot understood none of these choices were clean. They watched faces, not ideology. Savitsky's jaw set when another thump shivered the bulkheads. Maslenikov's hands were steady on the key he already turned. Arkhipov's eyes kept tracking the panel, the clock, the men swaying on their feet. He had to convince them that humiliation was safer than heroism, that restraint was a form of command, not its absence. In the end, personalities mattered because doctrines collided in human bodies. Savitsky's courage, Maslenikov's conviction, Arkhipov's caution, they weren't opposites. They were forces that had to balance in seconds. And balance would depend on one man's ability to take the heat of saying no and hold it longer than pride could. Breakdown at sea, heat, noise, and silence. The first thing to fail wasn't a machine. It was time. Hours smeared into each other as the boat slipped, drifted, and waited. Radio checks brought only hiss. The operator tapped the set, adjusted gain, ran through frequencies. Nothing clear from Moscow, nothing that could be called an order. News came as fragments caught on civilian bands when they dared rise a few meters, words like blockade, quarantine, shoot down. They filled the gaps with guesses. Guesses turned into stress, and stress into a low, grinding panic. Batteries ran like a bank account everyone could see draining. Every knot at depth cost a minute of tomorrow. Savitsky kept the speed low, then lower, until moving felt like sinking. To charge, they had to snorkel. To snorkel, they had to risk a mast snaring radar beams and a smell of diesel betraying them to helicopters that could dip sonar like a stethoscope over a beating heart. Inside, the boat turned hostile. Saltwater found leaks, trickled over wiring looms, and every drip became a small crisis. You don't want fresh water on circuits. You really don't want the ocean. Electricians wrapped tape with trembling fingers and made the sign of the cross when no one was looking. Food lost the fight. Bread went gummy. Canned meat tasted of tin. Tea became medicine, hot water a kind of comfort. Discipline held, but only because everyone on board knew what it looked like when it didn't. Orders snapped short so they wouldn't waste air. The quartermaster logged every course change with a pencil that slid on damp paper. The helmsman blinked sweat out of his eyes and kept the bubble centered. Sailors in their bunks, or what passed for bunks, counted the seconds between thumps overhead. When intervals shortened, chests tightened. When they lengthened, men finally let air out of their lungs. Arguments didn't flare, they simmered. A machinist's mate muttered that they should surface and end it. A torpedoman said surfacing was surrender. Someone told him to shut up. Nobody slept the way sleep works on land. They went absent, 10 minutes, 20, then woke thinking they'd been called. The body plays tricks in heat. You hear your name in the sonar ping. You see your mother's kitchen in the polished steel of a valve. Unknown to them, across the horizon, Washington sent another message to the fleet. Keep the pressure on, force them up. The Americans thought they were careful. They logged the size of each, signaling, charge, and wrote it into after-action reports. None of those reports captured what a 5-pound bang becomes in a boat where nerves are stripped raw. There was the silence too, not the peace kind. The kind where the fans stop because a breaker tripped, and for a heartbeat the boat feels dead. Then the humming returns, the vibration that says the ship still has pulse, and relief shows in shoulders loosening and jaws unclenching, until the next bang. The battery chief ran his numbers. If they stayed down, the charge curve wasn't a curve anymore, it was a cliff. He sent a note up, 2 hours before we hit the point of no return. 2 hours meant 90 minutes, then 70, as the boat tried to dodge patterns laid by destroyers they couldn't see. Savitsky weighed it. Surface near night to hide in the clutter. Surface now, and take the humiliation while men were still on their feet, or ride it and trust the Americans would pause. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the crew's heads. The idea of war moved from maybe to probably. A rumor said an American pilot was dead. That meant retaliation. Someone else swore they'd heard Kennedy threaten strikes. Each new burst of charges felt like a verdict. The political officer walked the compartments, spoke about duty, about the motherland, about holding firm. It helped for a few sentences at a time. Equipment joined the argument. A gasket on the cooling system swelled and bled. A sonar contact blurred when the set overheated. The periscope eyepiece burned a man's brow when he tried to look too long. The sea is patient, machinery is. Every repair took hands they didn't have to spare. Every delay shaved options. They tried snorkeling again. The mast broke the surface, and with it came the noise of a different world. Rotors, distant turbines, the slap of waves on hulls. Then the bangs resumed closer. A helicopter's dipping sonar found them like a finger tapping the top of the skull. The snorkel valve slammed shut as water tried to come down their throat. Diesel engines coughed, then quieted. Back to batteries. This was the moment everything changed on board, and nobody would mark it in a log. A sailor fainted at his post. He fell slow, like a man who decided to sit, and didn't wake when they lifted him. The corpsman fanned him with a clipboard until he opened his eyes and started to cry without sound. That's when even the bravest men thought enough. Enough of the thumps, enough of staring at needles sliding the wrong way. That thought, enough, can push a finger the last millimeter on a key. Savitsky looked at Arkhipov. Maslenikov watched both. The three of them felt the boat tightening around their decisions. Outside, the Americans kept dropping their messages. Inside, heat, noise, and silence did their work, stripping choices down to two: fire into the dark or reach for air. The Hunter's Net, US ASW Tactics Titan. OB-59 baked in the deep, the surface turned methodical. The quarantine line wasn't just ships in a row, it was geometry laid over ocean. Destroyers ran racetrack patterns, overlapping arcs that left little quiet water. Sonobuoys chatted to aircraft. Helicopters dropped dipping sonar, listening cones that could find a diesel's heartbeat. To the sailors topside, it was textbook. To the men below, it felt like a noose. Washington's guidance sounded careful on paper. Use signaling depth charges, tiny practice explosives, to tell Soviet subs surface and identify. The commanders called them PDCs. They logged weights, 5 pounds, 10, and believed that made it restrained. But restraint doesn't translate through hull steel and heat. A thump is a thump, and 10 in a row is pressure, not punctuation. The USS Randolph led a hunter-killer group, with destroyers like USS Beale and USS Kenai fanning out as pickets. Sonar crews squinted at green screens, marked smudges as contacts, and called bearings up to the bridge. There was urgency in their voices because the White House wanted results. Force them up, don't sink them. Simple in a briefing, messy on a heaving deck at night. 3 days earlier, a Soviet sub had slipped by, and the admiral didn't want a second miss. So the pattern tightened. Kenai's sonar pinged, got a return, lost it, then found it again, slow, deep, evasive. Contact likely Foxtrot, the operator said, and even he heard the edge in his own voice. Across the net, Beale cut in, reporting cavitation whispers through the layers. Unknown to them, it was B-59 trying to nurse batteries while drifting toward a seam in the cordon. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the air. A U-2 had been shot down over Cuba, and Kennedy's staff felt the ground tilt beneath them. A kill demands a response. Generals said so into smoky rooms. But the response at sea had been set the day before. Signal, pressure, surface. The destroyers didn't know how close they were to a different kind of warhead within torpedo range. They thought they were nagging a sub, not poking a loaded bear. Kenai dropped the first string of PDCs. Water leapt, white and brief. Seconds later, another set closer. On B-59, gauges shivered. Above, a helicopter hovered, its rotor wash combing the waves, its dunking sonar cycling. The pilot's headset cracked with clipped orders. Hold station, maintain contact, be ready to vector the destroyers in. Everyone was playing their role, none of them hearing the heat-heavy breath in the Soviet control room. The manual said, if contact goes evasive, increase signaling. The ocean made that a loop. The more B-59 tried to slide away, the more the Americans filled the water with bangs. The more the bangs, the more convinced B-59 became that the next one might be real. This was the hazard baked into careful pressure. It assumes the other side is calm enough to interpret your care. USS Beale's captain peered through binoculars at nothing but foam and a hovering speck. He'd been told the Soviets would prefer surfacing to damage. He'd also been told not to let one of them reach Cuba unchallenged. Those two orders coexisted uncomfortably in his head. He passed the word, keep the cadence, do not escalate. Then he ordered another pattern laid along the bearing line. Unknown to Beale, down below a vote was forming. Unknown to B-59, up above there was a petty officer tapping out an infrared signal. Flashes meant to say, in a language nobody underwater could see, surface. The sea swallows nuance. What rose and fell through the layers were shocks and pings, pressure waves and prop noise. This was the moment everything changed for the Americans, too, though they didn't feel it that way. Kanai's sonar tracked B-59 turning, then slowing. The contact seemed to linger at a depth where batteries die faster. The operator chewed his lip and reported a possible stall. To him, that meant success. To Savitsky, it meant a clock running out. A memo in Washington had warned of misinterpretation. It sat in a folder while the destroyers executed doctrine. Out on the deck, sailors counted off intervals between drops and marked them with grease pencils on casings. In the wardroom, a lieutenant said they were herding the bear. In B-59's compartments, nobody felt herded, they felt hunted. The hunter's net tightened because it was designed to. Layers of sensors, overlapping roles, a rhythm of pressure. It worked the way Western officers hoped right up until it demanded the hunted interpret mercy as mercy. That's a lot to ask through steel, heat, and fear. Kanai's captain ordered one more run. Beale matched. The sea answered with concussion. And below, 3 men weighed whether the next answer would be nuclear. The confrontation. The order to arm the nuclear torpedo. Another string of charges rolled over the hull, closer, heavier. Panels rattled. A wrench skittered across the deck and rang against a valve. Savitsky didn't flinch. He leaned into the plotting table, eyes on the fading pencil track that marked Kanai's last bearing, and said it plain, prepare the special weapon. The room's heartbeat quickened. The words changed the air. Men straightened. Maslenikov's hand was already near his key. He met the captain's eyes, nodded once, and said, "We can't be led like cattle to the surface." The torpedo officer glanced toward Arkhipov, then back at his crew. He barked orders that came out hoarse. Unlock the safe, bring the kit, stand by tube 1. Stakes crowded the room. If they launched and missed, the Americans would answer with steel and fire. If they hit, the ocean would turn white and hot, and the world above the water would have to decide what came next. Down here, the immediate promise was simpler. A blast to push back the hunters, a pocket of time to breathe. Action began in fragments. The political officer produced his half-key with a practiced motion. The torpedomen moved like men wading through syrup, hauling the arming box forward, sweat slicking the handles. Someone cut the sealing wire. Someone else read aloud the checklist they'd rehearsed in drills, the words tinny against the pounding in their heads. The boat shook again. A lamp blinked, then steadied. Maslenikov turned his key in the panel that unleashed the locks. It clacked, an unmistakable sound. Savitsky took that as momentum. He snapped at the torpedo officer. Time to arm. The answer came back. Minutes. Minutes they didn't have. He gave the order to load conventional torpedoes in parallel, a hedge that made sense and didn't, because nothing about this was parallel anymore. Impact rose around them, the near-term kind. In the forward compartment, a sailor swayed and caught himself on a bulkhead. In the control room, a gauge needle jittered into the red and eased back. The doctor hovered near the ladder with a bottle of salts and a face that said he'd seen enough men go down today. The weight of consequence made mouths dry. Arkhipov stepped in then, his voice even but hard. Stop. He wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. The torpedo officer froze. The captain didn't. Savitsky's jaw worked as he said, "We're under attack. We can't surface to be paraded. If they force us up, we're dead or disarmed." He said it like a fact that had been obvious for hours. Maslenikov added that doctrine authorized the special weapon when under threat and cut off from command. He quoted phrases they'd all heard. Do not surrender initiative. Do not permit capture. Arkhipov didn't argue doctrine first. He argued physics and escalation. Those charges are signals, he said. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. They're pushing us up. We surface on our terms, he said. We show the flag. We keep our heads. He looked at the panel where Maslenikov's key sat turned and said, that key isn't the last word. The last word is what happens to cities. Skepticism ran through the room. Signals. It didn't feel like signaling. Another concussive thud made the deck shiver. Savitsky cut in. Your signals will drown us. The batteries are done. We don't have time to wait for compassion from destroyers. His voice stripped away everything but survival. Arkhipov answered with another kind of survival. If we launch, he said, we kill an American ship. Then we're not a submarine with a problem. We're the first strike in a war we can't control. He didn't say nuclear war. He didn't need to. The word hung unspoken because it didn't belong to sailors. It belonged to people ashore who'd never smelled the boat. Maslenikov lifted his chin and spoke of duty. The party entrusted this weapon to us for this exact situation. He said honor, and the word made sense to men who'd been pounded for hours. Arkhipov pivoted to authority. As flotilla chief of staff, equal to the captain, he had to concur. He did not concur. He said it without heat. He said it like a hatch dogged shut. The protocol dispute surfaced hard. On most boats, 2 signatures would have been enough. On this one, 3 mattered. Savitsky's face tightened. He wasn't used to being vetoed in his own control room. He told Arkhipov he'd take full responsibility. Arkhipov shook his head. There was no such thing as full responsibility for this. Responsibility will be counted in cities. Action stuttered. The torpedoman held position, hands on straps, waiting for the next verb. The sonar operator called out bearing changes above, circling, not closing. A small relief bled into the space between sentences. It might have been nothing. It became leverage. Impact, right then, was a math problem. Batteries said, you have minutes before darkness. Crew physiology said, you have less. Pride said, never surface under pressure. Arkhipov asked a narrower question. Can we climb to periscope depth without choking? The battery chief nodded barely. Savitsky weighed humiliation against the chance to control the surfacing. He hated the weight. Another bang hit. A cup fell and cracked. The doctor muttered a prayer. Maslenikov pressed, we arm now or we never will. Arkhipov moved closer to Savitsky so only he could hear and said one line that cut through everything. We can still choose. If we fire, we never choose again. Silence gathered in a boat that never had silence. Savitsky's shoulders dropped a fraction. He stared at the plotting table, at the pencil line that meant a destroyer waiting. Then he exhaled. Disarm. Prepare to surface. Relief and dread moved together. The torpedo officer stepped back from the panel like from a cliff. Maslenikov's mouth thinned, but he didn't fight the order. Arkhipov gave the sequence. Blow to periscope depth, check air, then up. The crew moved, not fast, not slow, like men who just walked away from an edge and were about to meet another. Ghost of K-19, the scar that saved millions. To understand why Arkhipov could stand in that furnace and say no, you have to go back a year to a different steel coffin with a different kind of heat. K-19, hotel class, the pride of a fleet rushing to match the Americans. July 1961, North Atlantic, southeast of Greenland. A hiss in the reactor loop turned into a verdict. The primary coolant failed. No backup. No playbook. They were young men handed a problem older men pretended couldn't happen. Captain Nikolai Zatiev kept his voice flat as he told engineers to improvise a secondary cooling circuit out of pipes, valves, and prayer. They did it with bare hands and light protection, crawling into a space that sang with invisible danger. They jammed lines together, watched gauges climb, and kept the core from going critical. It worked. It also bathed the crew in radiation that nobody could smell until the vomiting started. Arkhipov was executive officer. He watched men stagger out of compartments with grey faces and bloody gums. He stood in the passageway when an officer's hair came out in clumps on a pillow. He heard the doctor's numbers turn useless because there was no antidote for what swam in their blood. Over the next hours, the reactor stabilized. Over the next days, K-19 limped home. Over the next months, funerals stacked up. The boat earned a nickname whispered in barracks, Hiroshima. Culture mattered as much as physics. Official reports softened edges. Secrecy wrapped mistakes in euphemism. Medals pinned over grief. Arkhipov learned the cost of a system that hid problems behind slogans. He also learned what panic does when it wears a commander's face. On K-19, speed saved a core and killed men slowly. On B-59, speed could kill cities fast. He carried that lesson like a weight you forget about until you pick up something else. In a control room, a year later, with CO2 rising and tempers thin to wires, he recognized the early signs. The urge to act for the sake of acting, to trade uncertainty for irreversible. He knew how bad information multiplies in heat. He knew that when you can't trust your senses, you fall back on habits. His habit after K-19 was simple. Slow the decision, expand the frame, ask what the action creates that you can't undo. There was another thing he brought from K-19, credibility with sailors who'd seen him there. Survivors carried a look the others recognized. It wasn't bravado, it was a steadying. On B-59, when he said the charges were signals, not an attack, he wasn't guessing. He was reading intent through pattern. If the Americans wanted them dead, they had enough steel nearby to make it happen. Instead, they banged the water like a fist on a table. Angry, yes, but not lethal. Maslenikov called that naive. He said the enemy used deceit. Arkhipov didn't disagree about deceit. He just understood escalation. Launching the special weapon would take the choice away from everyone on that boat. It would hand it to people in rooms with maps and phones. He'd seen what those rooms do when they're fed panic. K-19 also taught him about pride. Their men had risked everything to avoid the shame of losing a reactor. The state later called it heroism. He kept the private ledger, names, faces, the wife who came to the pier and didn't find her husband. On B-59, surfacing under pressure tasted like humiliation. He calculated that taste against the bitterness he'd already swallowed. Humiliation fades, fallout doesn't. Get this, he wasn't a saint. He was tired, scared, and breathing air that felt like soup. But K-19 had rewired his reflex. When a system pushes you toward the cliff, the first job is to find friction. In that room, his veto became the friction. He could hold the process long enough for another perception to enter. The cadence of charges easing, the bearings circling, the battery chief's nod that they could reach periscope depth. Tiny facts, just enough to wedge between impulse and catastrophe. Later, when he spoke publicly about submarines near Cuba, he was careful. He disliked sensational accounts. He didn't want colleagues slandered by half-told stories. That wasn't modesty. It was discipline learned in a navy that punished the wrong kind of truth and rewarded the wrong kind of speed. He knew how close they'd come. He also knew that the lesson wasn't a single hero. It was what experience can do to a decision at the worst possible moment. On K-19, improvisation under pressure kept a core intact. On B-59, restraint under pressure kept the world intact. Both choices were born in the same place. A man who'd seen panic dressed up as duty and refused to wear it again. The vote, refusal, command, and a surfacing. The argument didn't end so much as thin into a kind of waiting. Men held positions they could barely sustain. The torpedo room stayed poised on a decision that might never come. Savitsky gripped the edge of the plotting table, felt the vibration of another signal roll through his forearms, and forced himself to look at Arkhipov, not at the panel where Maslenikov's key still sat turned. Stakes were stacked in front of him. If he yielded, he'd surface under American eyes, a captain paraded into the light. If he didn't, he'd fire a weapon the other side couldn't have imagined on a diesel boat, and the world would answer in ways he couldn't shape. He'd been trained to choose the option that preserved command. Both options threatened him. Action broke the stalemate. Arkhipov spoke first, steady. According to flotilla procedure on this flagship, nuclear release required the concurrence of all 3 senior officers. He withheld his consent. He didn't make it personal, he made it structural. Then he layered doctrine onto seamanship, Propulsion could still carry them to periscope depth. Air quality allowed minutes. Surfacing on their timing kept agency. He pointed at the clock, not the key. Maslenikov answered with the party's clarity. They were under sustained pressure, cut off from Moscow. The rules anticipated this. He said the word authorized, like a line that would shelter them from accusation later. He didn't yell. He looked at their faces and offered certainty in a room that had none. Agree now, he implied, and the blame would be shared by the state that issued the weapon. Impact pressed in. A rivet pinged. A panel buzzed and fell quiet. A sailor swallowed hard and stared at the deck so he wouldn't be seen swaying. That's when Savitsky asked the torpedo officer how long to reverse the steps already taken. Seconds to safe the panel, minutes to reseal the kit. The answer came with a catch in his voice. This was the moment everything changed, quietly with no hero's flourish. Savitsky straightened and said it like an order he hated. Stand down the special weapon. Prepare to surface. He didn't look at Maslenikov. He didn't look at Arkhipov. He looked at the men who would carry the shame and wanted them to hear firmness, not apology. Relief ran through the boat like a draft of cool air that didn't exist. The torpedoman backed away from the sacred metal with hands that trembled only after they were empty. Maslenikov's jaw tightened. He didn't move to turn his key back. He said, for the record, that he disagreed. That mattered because records mattered later. He had to protect the story he might be ordered to tell. Arkhipov nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and shifted the room to the next task. Blow to periscope depth. Check the mast. Scan. Then we go up. It sounded routine, and that was the point. Reset the boat's rhythm from brink to procedure. The diving officer repeated the commands. Valves answered with coughs and clanks. B-59 eased upward through layers that felt like centuries. At periscope depth, the lens showed a world that should have been simple. A slate sea, rotor wash ruffling it, a destroyer's grey flank sliding across a narrow circle. The scope kissed the air and the eyepiece burned skin. The radio shack listened for anything, voice, tone, a hint of meaning. Nothing they could use. That left only visibility as language. Savitsky grimaced. Up. Action now was choreography under humiliation. Ballast tanks hissed. The bow lifted, then the stern. The pressure's grip softened and gave way. The boat's spine adjusted to buoyancy. They breached into noise and blinding white. Spray slapped the sail. A helicopter hung off the bow like an insect. Across the waves, an American destroyer angled closer, not ramming, not firing, circling like a shepherd dog. Impact hit in a new form. Commands through a Loudhailer, unintelligible words delivered like orders to a crowd. B-59's bridge crew blinked into sun after heat and dark. Flags mattered again. So did gestures. Savitsky raised his binoculars and felt his hands steady, as if the ocean had decided to give him back a fraction of control. He ordered engines ahead slow, a turn to show compliance without surrender. Down below, the crew sagged against bulkheads and found that air had a taste other than metal. The doctor moved through the boat, pointing men toward water, toward the idea of later. Maslenikov slipped into the wardroom long enough to write a few lines in his notebook. Not a confession, an accounting. He would need it. Arkhipov stayed near the ladder, voice low, passing messages, translating humiliation into instructions. Don't answer provocation. Keep distance. If they signal, we acknowledge. He knew the next hours would be a negotiation conducted in stares, in spacing, in whether the sub's bow pointed toward open water or toward surrender. For the Americans, the sight of the Foxtrot's sail was a win. For B-59, it was a reprieve with a price. The vote had ended with a refusal that held. Command had reasserted itself by choosing the lesser fire. And surfacing wasn't safety. It was a thin bridge to a future where someone in Moscow might decide that this steady hand looked like weakness. Aftermath at sea. Interrogations through a Loudhailer. The first sound on the surface wasn't the sea. It was a metal voice bellowing across waves. Soviet submarine, stop your engines. The words came mangled through a Loudhailer, flattened by wind and rotor wash, but the tone was unmistakable. Command shouted at steel. B-59's bridge crew blinked in the glare. A destroyer slid abeam, USS Kenai, gray, bristling, controlled. A helicopter hung off the starboard bow, its crew pointing, filming, watching for any slip. Savitsky kept his binoculars steady and his face unreadable. He ordered ahead slow, then met the Loudhailer halfway with a brass megaphone that made Russian sound like gravel. "We are conducting repairs. Not an apology, not a challenge, just a reason to exist out here without surrendering the story." The American voice came back with a repeat. "Stop your engines, identify, proceed as directed." The choreography was set, shepherd and begrudging sheep. Below, the mood shifted like pressure bleeding off. Hatches opened to pass air. The smell of hot metal gave way to warm salt. Men leaned against bulkheads and let their knees shake. In the forward compartment, torpedomen resealed the kit and sat on their hands to stop the tremor. The doctor walked the line with canteens, dosing water like medicine. One sailor laughed once, too loud, then clamped his mouth shut. Survival had its own discipline. On the bridge, Arkhipov watched the destroyer's distance and made a language out of angles. Kenai held steady at a few cables, swinging in a patient arc that said, "We're close enough to control you, far enough to show we won't ram." The helicopter dipped, rose, dipped again. Maslenikov craned for flags, searching for a codebook answer that didn't exist under these rules. Everything was improvised and careful. The Americans tried another line through the Loudhailer, slower this time, as if English spoken at half speed could cross languages. "Follow us out of area." Savitsky didn't need the words. He needed the intent. He gave a small turn of the helm, enough to show movement in the direction they wanted, not enough to concede pace. A compromise carved out of degrees. Meanwhile, something else was happening on B-59 that nobody on the destroyer could read. Leadership reassembled itself. Orders came down the ladder with calm voices. "Vent here, check for leaks, log temperatures." Routine returned like a cloth wiped over a fogged gauge. In the engine room, the chief tapped the casing and felt it cool imperceptibly. In the mess, a cook set out weak tea and sweetened it as if sweetness could erase the last hour. The Loudhailer became interview and admonition wrapped together. "Do not submerge, maintain course." Each sentence landed like a test. Savitsky answered with habit, not anger. He raised his megaphone and replied with firm, short phrases. "Understood. Engine repairs. Proceeding as necessary." The Russians on the bridge knew they were being filmed, logged, catalogued. They held their posture like a parade performed on a tipping stage. Then came a new demand. "You will move away from the quarantine line." The word quarantine hung like a legal argument nobody aboard cared to litigate. Savitsky glanced at Arkhipov. A nod. He ordered a turn that pointed the bow toward open water. The gesture wasn't capitulation, it was a trade. Distance for time, space for dignity. Kenai mirrored, content to keep a grey shadow on their quarter. Inside, damage control reported hairline leaks sealed and code 2 levels falling. The air tasted less like pennies. A machinist sat down and realized his hands had gone numb. The doctor touched his shoulder and said, quietly, "You kept us running." Praise in a navy that rationed it tighter than fuel. Maslenikov slipped a notebook back into his pocket. His face had the set of a man storing arguments for later rooms. The dance continued. The Americans flashed a signal lamp. B-59 had no intention of reading Morse through glare and spray. The answer was course made good and speed kept low. A helicopter edged closer, its camera eye lingering. Savitsky lifted his binoculars and looked right back, as if to say, "We see you seeing us." Simple, human defiance wrapped in seamanship. Unknown to both bridges, a petty officer on Kenai told his captain the sub had wheeled toward them for a moment, unmasking torpedo doors when the bow lifted into a swell. The captain called it a misread and backed his ship off a cable. Even restraint needed luck. On B-59, no one knew how thin that margin had been. Hours stretched. The sun slid. The ocean settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Arkhipov leaned on the coaming and let the wind cool his face. Savitsky rolled the decision he'd made like a pebble in his mouth and didn't spit it out. Maslenikov stared at the wake and rehearsed sentences he'd need for men who'd never smelled depth charge residue. As dusk pulled a dim curtain over the choreography, B-59 eased her bow a little more toward emptier water. The Loudhailer fell silent. The helicopter peeled away. Kenai held station but widened her circle. No papers were signed. No words were agreed upon. The choreography worked because both sides wanted daylight more than drama. Down below, sailors finally slept for real. Not long, not deep, but real. And in that shallow rest, a thought flickered through the boat. We are still here. That was enough for one night. Moscow reception. Heroism recast as failure. Home didn't feel like home. It felt like a corridor lined with closed doors. B-59 limped into port, paint scalded, men thinner, eyes sunk. There was no band, no brass. Shore officers boarded first with clipboards and faces set to neutral. Report, they said, and the word meant confession. Debriefing started in rooms that smelled of stale tobacco and fear. The questions came clipped, already shaped. Why did you lose contact discipline? Why did you allow yourself to be forced to the surface? Why were engines not maintained to avoid such degradation? The forms had boxes for errors, not for what heat and CO2 do to judgment. Signaling depth charges existed in Moscow now as a memo line item, not as percussion in ribs. Savitsky sat straight and answered with the language of a captain who'd kept his crew alive. Batteries, heat, pursuit, signaling. The interrogator's pencil scratched a different story. Deviation from instructions, failure to evade, capitulation under pressure. When the subject of the special weapon brushed the edge of the table, voices lowered, eyes flicked to corners. The lock had held. The launch hadn't happened. That should have ended the paragraph. It didn't. The political need was simple. Victory through resolve, not survival through discretion. Khrushchev had traded missiles in Cuba for a pledge about Turkey and a promise of no invasion. The domestic line required discipline, not mess. B-59's surfacing was mess. So the narrative tightened around words like cowardice, panic, negligence. The men who'd endured an oven were recast as sailors who'd opened a window without permission. Maslenikov faced a separate heat. Political officers lived by orthodoxy. He had supported arming the special weapon and could argue he'd upheld doctrine. But doctrine on paper bends to politics in practice. His interrogators wanted a clean trail. No one had risked unauthorized escalation. Everyone had maintained control. He was told his notes were personal reflections, best forgotten. He nodded and understood the warning behind the advice. Arkhipov walked in with quiet shoulders. He didn't use the word hero, he used procedure. He outlined authority. Flagship concurrence required 3 signatures. He withheld his. He kept his tone flat, his sentences short. The response wasn't gratitude, it was suspicion. Had he undermined a captain at sea? Had he exceeded his remit? He was careful. He said, I complied with flotilla protocol. He didn't say, I kept cities standing. Punishment didn't come as prison. It came as paper and silence. Savitsky received a reprimand, entered into a record that would shadow promotions. His next command would be smaller, slower, away from prestige. The word indiscipline was stamped in a file that didn't list depth charge anywhere. He felt it like a bruise under the uniform. Maslenikov's standing flattened. Officially, he returned to duty. Unofficially, he was marked as a man who'd been in a room with a nuclear key when a captain hesitated. That stain isn't visible. It's audible in pauses when assignments are discussed. He learned to speak less in meetings. Arkhipov wasn't paraded. He was sidelined. No denunciation, no medal. Transfers came with polite phrases about needs of the service. He still advanced over years. Competence has gravity, but the incident vanished into a vault. He didn't push. He'd learned on K-19 how truth gets rearranged to fit speeches. Get this, Moscow did extract a lesson, just not the one the boat had earned. They amended signals about radio discipline, reissued guidance on endurance, talked about tropical ops. They didn't fix the ambiguity in nuclear release rules. Oral instructions had met chaos. Nobody wrote that sentence into new doctrine. The system preferred flexibility it could later disown. In a small apartment, away from briefing rooms, families asked what had happened. Wives heard routine patrol. Children were told training. Sailors who couldn't sleep through a door slamming said nothing about Loudhailers and circling destroyers. A few wrote letters in careful phrases that passed censors because they said almost nothing. Their bodies told more honest stories. Weight lost, coughs that lingered, a flinch at a dropped pot. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Washington's war room exhaled. The crisis ebbed, missiles packed into crates. Khrushchev sent letters that read like relief set to formal cadence. Unknown to both capitals, a torpedo nearly authored a different history. In Moscow, that near miss was classified, then buried. The men closest to it were told their proximity was a stain. Savitsky met his crew in a wardroom and spoke plainly. "We returned." He didn't add alive. He didn't have to. He told them discipline had been found wanting, that the service demanded more next time. He took the blame that protected them, even as blame settled on him from above. That's what captains do when the story turns against seamanship. Maslenikov filed his notebook deep in a drawer. He learned what not to remember. Arkhipov went back to sea, back to classrooms, back to quiet. He carried the weight of a refusal that had no place in official memory. The institution's verdict was clear. Heroic restraint looked like failure when seen through a lens that needed only obedience. The truth stayed in the heat, and the thumps and the word, no, held past pride. But for years, the only record that mattered was a line in a personnel file and a story told wrong on purpose. The White House and the Kremlin, parallel fear. While B-59 breathed thin air under Loudhailers, war rooms on both sides tried to breathe too. In Washington, ashtrays filled, jackets came off, voices sharpened. Kennedy sat at the end of a table that looked like a runway, listening to men who'd trained their whole lives to say, "Strike now." The Joint Chiefs pushed maps forward, airfields, missile sites, casualty estimates. They spoke in numbers that hid the faces behind them. Every option ended in columns no one wanted to read out loud. The president's jaw worked as he weighed it. Another U-2 had gone down over Cuba, Major Rudolph Anderson killed. The room demanded a response. But the quarantine, carefully branded, carefully executed, had bought hours. Hours mattered. Robert Kennedy leaned in and argued for one more round of pressure, not a punch. The generals frowned. They didn't like time. Time made civilians bold. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, Khrushchev paced inside a building that ran on slogans and worry. His letters had swung between blunt and pleading all week. He worried about Castro's nerve, about Kennedy's need to look strong, about his own hawks who thought missiles were leverage until they became targets. A draft sat on his desk that offered a trade. Pull the missiles if America promised not to invade. It was a climb-down wrapped in pride. He needed it to sound like victory. Unknown to both leaders, a diesel boat's vote had just given them the chance to keep arguing. Neither knew the Americans had circled a quarry carrying a nuclear sting. Neither knew a torpedo had hovered between armed and not. The crisis felt absolute in their rooms. It was a hair's width away from being irrelevant. Back in Washington, their ex-com circled through what-ifs. What if the Soviets fired on a boarding party? What if an American destroyer misread a Soviet signal? Air Force heads talked sorties like they were math. The Navy described the tight noose at sea. Kennedy kept asking the same question in different forms. What gets us through tonight without making tomorrow worse? He wanted steps. The chiefs wanted answers. Here's where it gets tense. A second letter from Khrushchev arrived, harder, angrier, tied to Turkey's missiles. It complicated the fragile line Robert Kennedy was threading with a backchannel. Jupiter missiles out, quietly, months later, if Cuba went quiet now. Most of the room didn't know that whisper existed. The president's job became translation, turning public toughness into private movement. In Moscow, Khrushchev's aides measured distance to catastrophe in commas. He dictated, paused, tried to find a tone that didn't sound like fear. He'd watched the Red Army on the move. He knew momentum has its own generals. There were voices telling him America would blink if pushed harder. He suspected D never sat across from mothers collecting bodies. He remembered Stalingrad. He had a practical streak hidden under the rhetoric. Parallel fear compressed language. In Washington, phrases like controlled escalation covered the fact that control dissolves once bombs fall. In Moscow, solidarity with Cuba covered the worry that solidarity would get Havana flattened and Moscow next. Meanwhile, ships steamed, pilots strapped in, and a destroyer's Loudhailer barked at a Soviet captain who just rejected a nuclear shot. One detail would matter later. Calm on the surface fed calm ashore. Reports flowed to the White House that subs were surfacing under pressure, not dying under depth charges. That gave Kennedy oxygen. He could tell his chiefs their tactics worked without blood. He could hold the line for talks. In the Kremlin, staff told Khrushchev the Americans hadn't rammed or fired live weapons at the Soviet boats. That gave him a sliver of face to save when he sent the final "we will remove" message. And still, both rooms had a blind spot. They thought their restraint was landing clearly on the other side. It was. The sea had garbled it. A man named Arkhipov had decoded it correctly and acted on that read. He made their restraint real. By night's end, Washington edged toward a trade, missiles out for a pledge. Moscow edged toward the same line, each trying to look like they'd led the dance. Neither speech would include a diesel subs control room, a key turned, and then not, or the decision that kept both leaders from becoming wartime names on schools and highways. Declassification, how the truth finally surfaced. Time buried the control room heat under paperwork and pride. For decades, B-59 was a line item in a secret ledger, surfaced under pressure, evaded, returned. The near launch lived in whispers, sealed files, and the nerves of men who didn't sleep well. Then the Soviet Union fell, and the vault door didn't exactly swing open, but hinges loosened. It started with fragments. A sailors' reunion in the early 1990s. A journalist chasing the submarine story that never made the evening news. Western researchers heard rumors, a diesel boat, a nuclear torpedo, a veto. They had names, Savitsky, Arkhipov, Maslenikov, but not the scene. Across oceans, American destroyer crews told their version. Signaling charges, a foxtrot that finally broke the surface, a tense dance done by the book. They didn't know the torpedo's nose held 10 kilotons. 3 days earlier in another timeline, that ignorance would have mattered. In this one, it became a gap historians leaned into. Conferences convened. Havana, 1992, Moscow, 1997. Veterans sat on panels under fluorescent lights and tried to fit hot memories into cool sentences. One voice cut through. Vadim Orlov, a communications officer from B-59, described the crush of charges, the captain ordering the nuclear torpedo assembled, the argument that followed. It sounded sensational because it was simple, minutes keys, a refusal. His account ricocheted through articles and documentaries. Meanwhile, something else was happening in archives. The National Security Archive in Washington stitched together cables, after-action reports, and Soviet publications. They published maps of the Foxtrots, tracks, and U.S. hunter-killer formations. The picture sharpened. 4 diesel subs sent to Cuba, each with 1 nuclear special. U.S. doctrine of signaling depth charges. October 27 as the day when caution almost broke. It confirmed the broad strokes, but details still bucked under the saddle. What exactly was said? How close did the weapon get to armed? In Moscow, the story met resistance. Careers had been built on tidy versions of 1962. Sensationalism, some officers said, a smear against the Navy. Vasili Arkhipov, by then a retired vice admiral who disliked theater, stepped onto a stage in 1997 and gave a talk that sounded like a corrective. He didn't grandstand. He described exhausted batteries, forced surfacing, U.S. forces 100 times stronger, and the fact that B-59 had to come up. He didn't narrate the argument key by key. He didn't need to. Between his lines sat the decision he'd shaped. Historians read his restraint as confirmation. He was the only eyewitness from the conning tower willing to speak in public, and his measured tone gave the story weight. The weapons specifics, T-5 nuclear torpedo, roughly 10 kilotons, clicked into place through Soviet sources and Western intelligence. A PBS documentary followed, layering interviews with Ketov and others who explained the 2-key rule on most boats and the 3rd concurrence required on the flagship. The paradox stood there in daylight. The deterrent was secret, the doctrine was ambiguous, the safety was human. Disputes didn't die. Some veterans argued Orlov overstated the immediacy of assemble and fire. Others insisted the captain's order was real, that only Arkhipov's refusal kept the process from tipping. The National Security Archive published more context on the 60th anniversary, including a translation of Arkhipov's 1997 presentation. It read like a man protecting colleagues from caricature and facts from erosion. He confirmed the pressure, the surfacing, the overwhelming American presence, and left space around the moment of veto that everyone else filled. Across the Atlantic, destroyer sailors learned, decades late, what had sat inside Tube 1. Some went pale. One wrote that the signaling handbook suddenly felt like tinder. The US Navy's own review of the crisis at sea took on a different hue. Tactics that relied on calm interpretation had worked because a Soviet officer, battered by heat and memory, interpreted them as calm. Recognition finally found a family. In 2017, Arkhipov's widow and daughter accepted the Future of Life award in his name. The citation didn't breathe fire, it thanked a steady hand. Newspapers called him the man who saved the world, a phrase he would have shrugged at. He died in 1998, kidney cancer likely linked to K-19's radiation, never seeing the headlines, never writing a memoir. The applause came decades late, after the man who earned it was gone. The truth surfaced the way submarines do when they're out of options, slowly, reluctantly, with watchers circling. Documents, testimonies, translations, and careful omissions formed a shape you could finally point to. Not a myth, a moment, a hand on a key and then off it. A no that took 50 years to be heard. Legacy and recognition, the reluctant savior. After the files loosened and the stories edged into daylight, you'd expect a parade. Arkhipov never got one. He'd already left the stage, retired as a vice admiral, steady career, classrooms and staff work, the kind of service that keeps fleets running. He died in 1998, kidney cancer shadowing back to K-19's radiation. No memoir, no interviews on late-night TV, just a quiet apartment and a family who knew he'd carried something heavy and unspoken. Recognition came late and sideways. In the 200s, documentaries landed in living rooms, cautious Russian recollections, American retrospectives that finally said nuclear torpedo out loud. His name moved from footnotes to headlines. The man who saved the world, a phrase he would have rejected because it turns a system failure into a story about one spine. Still, it's stuck because people need a face to hold when they think about near misses. In 2017, an award arrived that matched the tone of his life. The Future of Life Institute gathered his widow and daughter and handed them a plaque that said thank you, not for daring, but for restraint. The scene was understated. No flags, no marching band, family members standing in for a man who'd said no when it counted. The photos show composed faces, a kind of pride that doesn't flash. They'd waited 55 years for public words equal to the private memory. Meanwhile, arguments continued in rooms with bookshelves. Was this heroism or proof, a system nearly killed us by design? Historians leaned both ways, often in the same paragraph. The ethical debate kept returning to a simple hinge. If safety rests on one refusal inside a cramped control room, the doctrine isn't safe. Arkhipov's story became a case study in courses on nuclear command and control. Ambiguity meets heat, and only a human buffer stops the machine. The Navy, both navies, absorbed some lessons, if unevenly. Multi-person consent hardened into dogma, not just for show, but for pressure-tested reality. Submarine training layered in de-escalation under harassment, not as an apology for weakness, but as survival seamanship. Communications protocols tried to reduce the chance that signals felt like attacks. None of that erases friction at sea. It just gives the next Arkhipov a little more room to breathe. His legacy also landed closer to home. Sailors who'd served under him remembered a certain tone, few words, careful ones, no appetite for theater. Students in staff courses recalled how he drilled procedure until it became muscle memory, then asked the question most manuals skip: what happens after your action leaves the boat? He didn't say geopolitics. He said the next deck, meaning the decks you don't see. Get this, recognition didn't wash clean the record for everyone. Savitsky's reprimand stayed in archives. Maslenikov's careful notes remained private reflections. Later coverage tried to avoid cartoon heroes and villains. The better documentaries and articles gave each man his space. A captain making a brutal choice under fire, a political officer aligning doctrine in chaos, a flag officer slowing time. That balance matters because it answers a trap in the word savior. He didn't act alone, he acted last. There are memorials now, a plaque, a lecture series, a few solemn ceremonies where scholars and sailors stand together. They speak about near misses as if cataloguing storms. Arkhipov's name sits among others. Petrov staring at a radar screen in 1983, Kornevsky forcing calm in a silo. Patterns emerge. When systems push toward the cliff, the moments that save lives are quiet, stubborn, and unglamorous. His family kept the awards in a modest room. His widow once said he never talked about that day at length, just enough to make clear that calm helped. That feels right. The story doesn't need bigger adjectives. It needs the memory of a man in a boiling control room choosing humiliation over pride, procedure over impulse, and long odds over a short, bright flash. That's the legacy worth passing on. Restraint as a skill, taught, trained, and held under pressure. The fragile chain, lessons for modern nuclear command. What held in that control room wasn't a policy, it was a person. That's lesson one. Humans sit at the joints of systems built to move faster than thought. Arkhipov's veto was the safety, and the fact it had to carry the full weight was the weakness. Second, communication. Deterrence loves ambiguity, operators don't. Washington thought practice charges were careful signaling. B-59 heard pounding. Better tools exist now, acoustic hailing, burst comms, satellites, but the ocean still eats nuance. Doctrine must make restraint unmistakable. Third, consent and culture. Multi-person release rules only work if roles are crystal clear when heat shrinks judgment. On most Soviet boats, 2 keys, on the flagship 3. That quirk saved lives. Checklists fail if hesitation is punished. Train refusal as a skill. De-escalation is tactical competence. Drill ladder control. Step down under harassment without ceding safety. Script what surfacing looks like when pride is bleeding. Phrases, distances, headings that give both sides a livable story. By 10 minutes, they're gold. The strategic layer needs structured doubt. Warning systems cry wolf. Don't canonize mavericks. Build processes that reward challenge when evidence is thin and stakes are irrevocable. Two-man rule becomes two-man rule plus doubt. Clarity beats cleverness in signaling. Give destroyer captains one line. Do not escalate past X without explicit confirm. Give submarine commanders the mirror. If at Y, assume signaling until lethal evidence. Write it in verbs. Rehearse it under noise. Case studies anchor doctrine to faces. Arkhipov, Petrov, missileers who paused on spurious alerts. Patterns repeat. Ambiguous inputs, compressed time, pride as accelerant, a person inserting friction. Teach that friction is the last mile of safety engineering. Tech is both cushion and cliff. Better sensors reduce misreads. Automation speeds the wrong decision too. If an AI flags attack at 95%, who's authorized to say, show me the 5%? Write that policy before the night shift. Back, hold, calls at the top. Hotlines aren't museum pieces. Rehearse them. Pre-agree phrases that mean the same thing when voices shake. Even signaling charges need an international profile, weight, cadence, purpose, broadcast in peacetime. Finally, remember the body. Heat and exhaustion are variables, not atmospherics. Timelines should factor crew degradation like fuel. Doctrine that recognizes human limits isn't soft, it's functional. Arkhipov's control room won't repeat line for line. The shape will. Somewhere, a team will face noise that sounds like attack and rules that read like riddles. The chain holds when culture, tech, and training conspire to protect one small word. Give people room to say it, and back them when they do. Return to the control room, what almost happened. If Tube 1 had opened, the water would have taken the torpedo like it takes anything, without comment. 10 kilotons in a steel cigar, set to meet a destroyer's hull and turn sea to steam. Kenai or Beale, pick one, would have vanished into a white dome. Thousands of sailors in an instant. Radios would scream words nobody could clean up. Nuclear. Impact ashore would have been speed. The task force commander reports a detonation. Washington scrambles. No drill, no ambiguity. DEFCON steps down a rung with a thud. Air crews already in cockpits get the go. Quarantine becomes combat. The carrier group launches strikes against Soviet subs and surface ships. The Navy's rules of engagement snap to lethal. Moscow hears American attack on our forces and answers with its own escalations. Cuban sights on alert, air defense tight as a fist, a submarine commander elsewhere told not to be second. Khrushchev's bargaining letters die mid-sentence. The backchannel freezes. Each capital tells itself the other fired first. Each feels righteous and cornered. Within hours, Cuba burns. Missile sites, airfields, docks. Soviet commanders on the island ask permission to use what's left. Confusion meets fear. A battery fires. A US city's loss isn't inevitable, but pressure makes mistakes. A bomber misreads a radar return. An interceptor climbs. A pilot doesn't hear a recall through jamming. The ladder's rungs are close together. Europe flinches. NATO scrambles. Warsaw Pact units mirror. Phones don't calm anyone. They confirm the worst. The line from one underwater burst to cities is crooked, not straight, but it reaches them fast. Families in both countries eat breakfast, then evacuate, then don't. Back in that control room, the counterfactual squeezes into a single physical act, a hand finishing a turn. It didn't. That pause kept the next orders on paper, not in the sky. The next day existed because one shot never left its tube. The cost of one word, no. One refusal in a boiling steel room kept a weapon from writing millions of names into ash and absence. If this near miss sharpened your sense of how thin the margin is, stay with us. Subscribe to the War Room, turn on alerts, and watch the next briefing. The radar officer who chose doubt over launch. We break the myths, name the near misses, and show you the decisions that kept the lights on. Don't just watch history, learn how it almost ended.